Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle. Along with Sheldon Richmond, the foundation's vice president, this is the show that gives you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day, the perspective that you're not going to find in the mainstream media, the newspapers, the television networks, and so forth. Hey, Sheldon, of course, top of the news is that Bradley Manning, who now wishes to be called Chelsea Manning, received 35 years in a federal penitentiary for what? For disclosing the deep, dark, nefarious, dark side secrets of the national security state, including that infamous helicopter shooting. And, you know, this sentence really goes to show you the conflict of visions that is taking place in America today. On the one side, you've got those of us on the libertarian side that are trying our best to bring freedom and prosperity and limited government. And then you've got the side over there on the empire side, the national security state side, that wants to keep going down the dark side, keep sending us down into national bankruptcy with out-of-control spending, invading, occupying, torture, and, of course, trying to protect their dastardly little secrets here in the NSA and the Pentagon and the CIA. And the guy that pays the price for this is Manning. It's an absolute disgrace, and it really is showing the dark, nefarious side of the whole national security state. What do you think?
Well, it's a terrible tragedy that's going on. I mean, he got sentenced to 35 years. It could have been worse. He could have gotten up to, I forget what it is, 60, 90. I forget what the max is. He could have gotten as little as 25. So the judge, compromised. It is said that he could get out in 8 or 9. So that at least is something. And he does have appeals. Apparently, there are several layers of appeals that he can pursue, and there are some issues, whether they're the kind that can really prevail or not. I wouldn't be terribly optimistic about that, but there's certainly points there for appeal, I hear. So it's a sad thing. Life in prison is pretty bad. Life in prison for somebody like Manning could be terribly bad. I mean, he does have this personal issue where he wants to have sexual transformation hormones, and the military has said they won't put him, they'll put him in a male facility, so he could be in for something that we would consider cruel punishment, if not unusual. So that's something to be sad about. Let's hope he can prevail and get out. In my Friday article, the TGIF, just this past Friday, I did discuss the motives that he had for doing what he did. The government tried to portray it as something else. In fact, of course, they'd even charged him with aiding the enemy, something he was acquitted on, thankfully. But everything that we know about his motives, of course, are positive. He tried to take his issues the issues about the government misconduct up the chain of command and was dismissed. He had been involved in a matter of helping to round up Iraqis and turn them over to the Maliki government, where he knew they'd be tortured. And those people were not even connected with terrorism. They were people who had publicly criticized the Maliki government. Yet they were being branded insurgents, rounded up and turned over. When he realized he was participating in this, he stopped. He refused. He tried to take it to his commanding officer, and was told to shut up and go back to work. And there were other things like that. Of course, you alluded to the collateral murder video of the GIs in the Apache gunship shooting unarmed innocent civilians walking down the street, including 2 Reuters journalists, and then also firing on people who came to rescue them, a van that came to help, where there were 2 children involved who were wounded. So he couldn't stand by and just let this go on. So he decided he had to go to WikiLeaks on this, which is what he did. But I made another point that motives really are a secondary issue. I mean, it almost doesn't matter what his motives are. He had these noble motives, and I don't think we should ignore that. But even if he did it for money, he exposed government wrongdoing to the American people. That's a value in itself, and his motives are secondary. You can almost say we don't care what his motives are. The point is there was real misconduct, and he exposed it. And he should be thanked for that, and he should be pardoned for it, although I don't think Obama's going to even consider that. He shouldn't be spending time in prison.
Yeah, I don't think he deserves one day in prison. I think he deserves gratitude, and fortunately he receives the gratitude from a large sector of the private society in America. Certainly not from the national security state. It considers them a traitor and a bad person and so forth. It goes to this conflict of visions that I mentioned. But he doesn't deserve a day in jail. And notice that they always say that, oh, these are national security state secrets. And as you know, I've questioned this whole ridiculous notion of national security. It has no objective meaning at all. It's not found in the Constitution. Notice that, what's happened since all these secrets got divulged by Ed Snowden or by Manning. The nation's still standing. The federal government certainly is more powerful than it's ever been. You don't have the communists taking over the public schools, and you don't have the illegal aliens, running the interstate highway system. You don't have the terrorists running the IRS. Well, sort of. In other words, the disclosure of all this stuff hasn't affected anything adverse. It's just embarrassed the government. It's shamed the government. But they deserve to be shamed and embarrassed when they engage in wrongdoing. And that's what's so great about people and so heroic about people like Manning and Snowden. They risk their entire lives, their careers. Here this guy's going to spend, whether it's 10 years in jail or 30 years in jail or whatever. He has done that in order to bring us the truth about how the national security state's operating. And that's really what they're upset about, is that he disclosed the dark and nefarious secrets. Because once people start learning the dark and nefarious secrets of the national security state, then they start wondering, do we really want this edifice that was grafted onto our constitutional order in our midst? And as more and more people start to question that, I think that just scares the death out of the national security state people.
Well, they probably don't need to get too scared yet. I haven't seen any mass rallying to Manning. The polls aren't very clear cut on whether they side with him or not. So I'm not sure the people really care that much, unfortunately. It's funny that the people who, the anti-Manning people will say that two things which I think cancel each other out. One, that this was a grave lapse in national security, and on the other hand, we didn't really learn anything from this. So it really can't be both things. But there have been consequences, and Greg Mitchell at The Nation has been keeping very close track about what we learned because of Manning, and it's worth going over to that site and seeing it because he's chronicled this. Some of the disclosures have been credited with helping to set off the Arab Spring, for example, in Tunisia and also Yemen. It exposed the idea that the U.S. was launching those drone attacks in Yemen. The government had lied about that and first said it had done that and not let it be known that a foreign country, namely the U.S., was behind it. And there were other revelations. He's also been credited. His revelations have been credited really with the earlier withdrawal from Iraq than Obama would have wanted. Obama was trying very hard at the end of 2011 to get Maliki to quote invite America to keep troops there, but I know Obama's claiming credit for ending the war in Iraq, although it was Bush that had signed the agreement to get out. But Obama was trying his hardest to be allowed to keep troops there. When the revelations came out about what was happening in Iraq because of the war logs, Maliki was insisting that if you're going to keep troops here, the troops will be subject to Iraqi law. They won't have immunity. Obama wouldn't abide that and wouldn't agree to that. And Maliki then said, "Okay, you got to go." And so the troops are now have been out. That was not the way Obama wanted things to go. So the credit goes to Manning because of the revelations of the really ugly side of that war. Not that there was any nice side, but even the real underbelly of what was already a rotten situation.
Well, we also shouldn't forget that whenever they have cases of war criminals, once the dust settles, they end up letting them off the hook. And we saw that in Vietnam and with Lieutenant Calley. they give them a sentence, and all of a sudden the interest dies down, and they end up pardoning him or getting him clemency or whatever. And I doubt very seriously that they're going to do it with this guy, because they consider him a real criminal as compared to the people that are out there killing civilians and so forth in these ridiculous foreign wars. Hey, shifting gears, debt ceiling's back in the news. Supposedly that we'll be approaching the debt ceiling again, maybe October, November, and already the mainstream press is starting with their standard things about, we can't shut the government down, and we've got to raise the debt ceiling, and the Republicans are going to be irresponsible if they cause the government shut down, and all this same old Chicken Little nonsense that we hear every single time. And it's such a sham, because let's face it, Sheldon, the debt ceiling is at least an acknowledgement that too much debt is a bad thing. And I think we could go and talk to the Greek people, and they would verify that too much debt's a bad thing, or maybe to some of the cities that have gone bankrupt in America that incurred too much debt. And so the debt ceiling is pretty much an acknowledgement of that. And yet every time that we get the same nonsense, we have to raise the debt ceiling, we have to incur more debt. But as soon as it's done, and I said this the last two times, is the mainstream press ends up laughing their tails off as soon as the debt ceiling's raised again, because their little strategy worked. They got it raised again. But as soon as the vote's authorized, the vote is taken authorizing the debt ceiling to be raised again, never do you see the mainstream press saying, hey, look, we've now got to slash federal spending here. So that because the debt ceiling is going to be coming up, we got a reprieve for 2 or 3 years now, and we've got to slash spending here. So as to be able to meet that ceiling when it comes up again, they just laugh about it, because they know that every time they just call for more increased federal spending, knowing that when the debt ceiling comes up again, they'll start their little Chicken Little stuff about, the government's going to be shut down and all this nonsense. My opinion, we ought to just go ahead and let that ceiling operate, make the government operate within its means. No better way to balance the budget than that, where you have to operate off the incoming funds, because you can't incur any more debt, no more borrowing, and you live off your means. Obviously, it's not a pure libertarian solution, because it still has government engaged in a lot of illegitimate functions, but at the very least, it would stop the massive accumulation of debt that's taking place every single year. What do you think?
Well, yeah, it's not a debt ceiling. I called it once a debt sky. If it can be raised at will whenever they hit it, it's really not a ceiling. It's just a game you're playing. I always find it very curious that they say, well, we've got to raise the debt ceiling because this will only be to pay bills already incurred. Right, expenses already incurred by Congress. So this is not, they'll always say the debt ceiling is not about new spending, about future spending. It's about paying bills now that we've already, have already been presented to us. But so something I don't get. Why is Congress allowed to spend money that it won't have unless the debt ceiling goes up? I mean, even just, this is not necessarily a libertarian criticism. It just seems like it ought to be a normal mainstream criticism. You can only spend money that you know you actually have. And if you're counting on raising the debt ceiling, you shouldn't be allowed to spend that yet. It's like future money you don't have, and you may not have it if the debt ceiling is not raised. So that's really bizarre, and yet I never hear anybody raise that. They'll always insist this is not about new spending, it's only to pay old bills. Well, why are there old bills that are relying on a debt ceiling increase? I mean, I hope someday someone will answer that question. It's one of the mysteries of the universe for me. But that's right. I mean, the Fed, of course, the Fed's involved in all this too, which I wrote about recently. The spending's out of control, the borrowing's out of control, and everybody's a Keynesian basically. You mentioned the media, but most reporters, if they know any economics, they only know what they heard maybe in their first year of college, where they got the pure dose of Keynesianism, so they think government spending is necessary to keep the economy going, and if they might admit that the recovery is almost like a non-recovery, but they say, but that's because they're not spending or borrowing enough. So they're really mired in a unscientific way to look at how economies work.
Well, the classic example of this where the problem of federal spending, where they really don't want to do anything to solve this out of control federal spending problem, is Egypt. Here you have a classic military tyranny, massacring people, much as the U.S. supported Pinochet dictatorship did in Chile, and yet you have this $1.3 billion of military armaments. I think the total foreign aid to Egypt is 1.5 or 1.6 billion. I mean, if there was ever a case where you could say, we've got out of control federal spending, we got the debt ceiling coming up, let's start saving a little bit of money. Here it is. Here's your $1.5 billion in savings. You got the perfect excuse here. Military generals running this country in a coup. You got U.S. law saying a coup requires a termination of aid. And the fact that Obama can sit there and say, oh, well, it's not really a coup under U.S. law until I say it's a coup, and therefore I can continue furnishing this $1.3 billion in U.S. taxpayer money to these Egyptian tyrants. I think it demonstrates the whole mindset of Washington, the out-of-control spending, the moral bankruptcy, the whole shebang that is slowly but surely taking this country down.
Well, it just seems to me the old realpolitik, right? U.S. government interests, its geopolitical interests, the interests of its chief ally in the Middle East, Israel, all align itself with a strong military dictatorship in Egypt, because they don't want a democratic movement of any kind. They don't want Muslim Brotherhood. They don't want someone who's not going to be beholden to this, to be in with the program. In other words, with the geopolitical program. And so that aid, that money that goes to Egypt every year, not only does it go to fortify the military government dictatorship, which dominates the economy and every aspect of life, but it also neutralizes Egypt in the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It took, ever since Camp David in 1978, it took Egypt out of the picture, and that's extremely important for Israel and its supporters here, and the U.S. government, which is sees that that's how they see things. That's the shape of the Middle East that they want, with Egypt being an ally and being on board with the American program. So I agree with you. They play these word games, right? What good is any kind of restriction on anything if you have to call it a coup, but you can choose not to call it a coup, even if it's plainly a coup? I mean, what's the point of writing restrictions into laws if a little word game gets you out of it anyway? You might as well not even have the restriction.
Yeah, and I love this game they play about democracy, that, we love democracy and we're premier democracy spreaders, and that's what the U.S. empire is all about, and that's why we invaded Iraq, after those infamous WMDs didn't show up. And here they're supporting a brutal military dictatorship. And, democracy's fine until democracy ends up electing people that are not going to do what we tell them to do. And it's ironic also that the CIA in the last week finally, admitted formally that they had brought about this coup in Iran in 1953, where they ousted the democratically elected prime minister of the country in order to install another dictatorship there, the Shah of Iran. And they sit there and deny it for years and years, but the Iranian people knew it. So when the Iranian Revolution came along in 1979, U.S. officials were playing the innocent. Oh gosh, look what they're doing to our diplomats. They just hate us for our freedom and values and all this. Well, the Iranian people had been suffering under this dictatorship for some 25 years or so. It was a U.S. installed and U.S. supported and U.S. trained brutal dictatorship. That's why they were risking their lives to oust the Shah from power, because he was so brutal. Just as brutal as this Egyptian military dictatorship is. This is the whole line of hypocrisy that pervades the U.S. empire. And Americans sit here and say, why do people hate us so bad? Well, hey, take a look at what your government's been doing to people overseas, ousting democratically elected regimes, installing dictators, supporting dictatorships, and then you start getting a good sense of why people hate America around the world.
Yeah, and it hasn't quit yet, because they're making the daily lives of regular, everyday Iranians miserable with the sanctions, which are increasingly harsh, and people still push for even harsher sanctions, and the U.S. is putting the screws to countries around the world and companies around the world to make sure that if they don't honor the sanctions, they can't participate in the international financing system. So they have lots of ways to force people to go along. And, the media likes to talk about how this is taking its toll on the Iranian economy, which is such a sterile way to describe it, because economies are people. There really are not economies. There are people engaging in various kinds of relationships, exchange, and similar things. And that's what we call an economy. So if you put the screws to an economy, you're putting the screws to people. And it's not usually the rulers that suffer. And yet, for some reason, the establishment and the media would want to play this game at the American people, so it doesn't fully hit the American people in the face that once again the United States of America is making the daily lives of Iranians hell. And if someday there's some kind of action that shows how mad they are at us and want vengeance, once again Americans will say, oh my gosh, what did we do? We were just minding our own business. They must hate us for our freedom. Amazingly, the Iranian people don't hate Americans. They may hate the U.S. government, but they don't hate the rest of us. And we've got to keep the distinction in mind. And we've got to fight these sanctions, because there are people that want ever harsher sanctions and then, of course, war against Iran. And that would be a monstrous crime.
Well, you saw the same phenomenon. You see the same phenomenon in Cuba, which has suffered under the sanctions or embargo or blockade, whatever you want to call it, and brutal embargo where the U.S. government actually punishes foreign companies for doing business with Cuba, prohibits them from doing business with the United States as well. And the Cubans draw that same distinction. The Cubans love the American people. They really hate what the U.S. government has done to them. And yet the mainstream media sits there and just operates like this is all normal and it's just part of the national security state, and they need to defer to the national security state officials, that they know what's best for America. And you see it with this debate in Egypt, that the only debate is whether it should be temporarily suspended, the aid. It's only the libertarians that are raising the entire paradigm of get the U.S. government out of the affairs of these other countries. Eliminate the foreign aid to everybody, Israel, Egypt, the whole thing, end the embargoes, end the sanctions against all these other countries. In other words, rein in the federal government, make it a government of limited powers, but liberate the American people to interact with the people of the world, trade, travel, go to Cuba if you want to. I mean, this was the vision that made America so different, where we had a reined-in, limited government that would not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, would not go abroad to invade and occupy and torture and rendition and sanction and embargo nations, but where you have a strong private sector that's going abroad and making friends with the world. I mean, this was our country the way it was established. Everything's turned upside down thanks to the statists and, of course, the mainstream press, which is, to me, is just a mouthpiece for the government in so many instances.
And, of course, the latest monster to destroy is Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. And there's new pressure, of course, on Obama to get involved there because of the so-called red line. There's allegations that there was a recent use of chemical weapons. Although I've read some journalists who keep a close eye on this stuff who say the evidence is not quite clear. The videos that have been released don't really back this up. And so there are people who are seizing on it who want us to go to war against Syria, both because they want to knock out Assad and also because his chief ally is Iran. So it's a way of getting out Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. But luckily, so far, and we need to grasp onto something, Obama and the military don't seem to be real eager to get into a war in Syria. I mean, they know what happened in Iraq, and they've, at least to some extent, have learned a lesson and don't want to get bogged down. It doesn't mean they're not going to find some other way. I think it seems to me the chance of troops getting sent are pretty small, but that doesn't mean they'll be able to resist all temptation and all pressure and not do things like impose a fly zone, which means planes can get shot down and innocent civilians can get killed when anti-aircraft facilities are bombed. So this is a nervous time, both between Syria and Iran. The danger has not passed there for the U.S. getting involved in another quagmire, one way or another.
Yeah, I don't, at first I thought that Obama he's not going to do it. But now with these revelations about the chemical warfare, I suspect he very well may undertake some type of military action. And let's not mince words here, that whatever he does of a military nature against the Syrian regime, cruise missiles or whatever, that's an act of war. And as I blogged today, where in the Constitution does it authorize the President of the United States to use his army to attack a country based on war crimes that a dictator has committed against his own people or supposedly committed? It's not really even clear how Obama is supposed to be reaching this verdict that Assad is guilty of this particular war crime. He's going to just do it in consultation with his national security advisors. But where in the Constitution does it authorize the president to do such thing? It doesn't. And we've got to keep in mind that the Constitution is the highest law of the land. They expect us to obey their laws, like their stupid little drug laws. They're expected to obey our law, and our law is that Constitution. And Obama could say, well, the Constitution gives me the authority to wage war. Oh, but only after he's gotten a congressional declaration of war. And he certainly doesn't have that against Syria. And then look at the practical side of this thing. This guy sends a cruise missile or whatever into Syria. That's an act of war. And that means a state of war. That then legally entitles Syria to engage in retaliatory strikes against America. And we'd like to think, it's only going to be soldiers fighting soldiers and such a thing. But we all know that these kind of countries, these kind of regimes, they end up engaging in terrorist attacks. And you can hear it now. Some terrorist attack by some Syrian sympathizer, and it's all, they hate us for our freedom and values. Oh, woe is us. What does this have to do with U.S. foreign policy? Well, it's all going to be rooted in this military strike, an act of war that Obama unleashes on Syria, if in fact he does so.
Well, I think you missed one point, though. Just the way they don't need to call a coup, they don't need to call a war. Just look back to Libya, where they said they didn't need to invoke the War Powers Resolution, which most people read as something that the president does have to invoke when you send military assets into a conflict, which is what happened in Libya. But they never did it. And what happened? There were no consequences. And in fact, we can go back to Korea, right? They just called it a police action, not a war. So that train, unfortunately, has left the station.
Yeah. I mean, it really goes to show you it's really like I blogged today. It's the president exercising dictatorial powers. I mean, in foreign affairs, he is not restrained by the Constitution. He doesn't feel constrained. He can do whatever he wants. He can send the entire nation into war on his own initiative. What clearer case of dictatorship than that? So you've got this ironic situation where the president of the United States is exercising dictatorial powers in order to retaliate against a dictator who's used dictatorial powers against his own citizens. Hey, let me shift gears in the last few minutes we have here about do a domestic issue, the airline merger. The feds are saying that United Airlines and U.S. Airways cannot merge because this would be a big company, a super big company, which is absolutely so ridiculous. I mean, for one thing, they don't say anything about the Postal Service. There you have a clear classic case of a monopoly, which is a situation where the government stops competitors from entering into a market. That's a monopoly. A company that is merging, why shouldn't they be free to merge? It's their business. This is what private property is all about. This is what competition, this is what the free market brings in terms of competition. It brings the freedom of people to do what they want with their own money. And that may entail competition. It may entail one company ending up, but as long as there's freedom of entry in terms of other companies coming in to compete, that's all that really should matter. And as far as I'm concerned, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which of course they bring in these kind of actions, is long outdated. It should never have been enacted in the first place. U.S. Airways and American Airlines should be free to merge to their heart's content. What do you think?
Well, I agree. I'd go further and say we need to privatize airports, because the airports need to be truly market competitive. Most airports are municipal and a governmental authority of some kind, regional authority. So there's a political taint there. So there's lots more to be done as well. But I don't think the government should be interfering with mergers. These economists and lawyers who sit in these offices, like at the Justice Department or the Federal Trade Commission, will look at they'll run those simulations and say this is going to reduce competition. But their simulations aren't the real world market. In fact, I read the other day that in determining how many routes there are where American and U.S. Airways don't compete, and therefore if they merge, there won't be competition. They left Southwest Airlines out of the picture on the grounds that it was minor. Even though Southwest is one of the biggest companies in the country, they just excluded it and said, sure, if you look at routes and don't count Southwest, then you might say, well, if they merge, there's only going to be one airline there. Yeah, well, that's because you're not looking at another airline, namely Southwest. So, who knows? It's arbitrary how they define the market, how they define, their a competitive situation when they're running their computer models. But it doesn't tell us anything about the real world. And so antitrust and government interventions of that nature are never going to be responsive to consumers and really, they're not going to foster competition. There's always going to be some artificial impediment to it.
Yeah, your point about privatizing the airports is great, because then you could also get rid of the TSA and leave airline security to private airlines and private airports. And if they really were interested in competition, why don't they allow competition in the political process against, the statist party, which is really, the Republican and Democratic Party, which is really one big party, the party of statism. They've got all the ballot access restrictions to the Libertarians. It's very difficult for independents to get on the ballot in many of these states. And, this nonsense, we're just trying to protect competition, is just bull. It's all about power, and it's usually about money. But anyway, our time's up, Sheldon. That's the Libertarian Angle for today. If this is the first time you've been watching one of our Libertarian Angle shows, come by and visit our website or Facebook. Get on our Twitter accounts at the Future of Freedom Foundation. We've got a great monthly journal that Sheldon edits called Future of Freedom. We've got a daily FFF email publication that we put a lot of time into producing every day. And we got some speaking tours coming up in the fall, an economic liberty lecture series at George Mason University. Got a lot going on, so we'd love to have you become a part of it and a supporter of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.